to the Off the Cuff podcast. Today we're lucky enough to have Michael Fabricant. A well-known politician and broadcaster, he was the MP for Mid Staffordshire from 1992 before it was renamed Litchfield in 1997. During his time in Parliament, he held numerous positions in both opposition and government, including time as a shadow trade minister, drawing on his experience selling radio and TV studio systems abroad, and a senior whip when he was responsible for ensuring government legislation passed under the leadership of David Cameron. Over his years as an MP, his majority increased election on election to a whopping 23,638 in 2019. In July 2024, he left Parliament alongside 250 others in the Labour landslide. But today we'll be able to hear about his time inside and outside the mother of all parliaments. Welcome, Michael.
Hi, Fiona.
Thank you so much for joining us. So firstly, can you tell us a bit about your political journey and what made you go into politics?
Well, it wasn't my intention to become a politician at all, actually, but I was running this radio group, which you mentioned, following my starting off as a broadcaster and going to university and all the rest of it. And the chairman was a chap called Geoffrey Johnson Smith, who was an ex-television presenter and a member of Parliament. And we used to have quite interesting discussions. And he said, well, just if you're not interested in maybe for the rest of your life doing what you're doing, you might want to consider being an MP. And because, we used to talk about different things that I thought were good in the Conservative Party and things that I thought was bad in the Conservative Party. Anyway, I joined my local Conservative association. I couldn't be at that time a councillor because spending so much time abroad. One thing that all my trips abroad taught me, actually, was that I wanted Britain to leave it wasn't even called the European Union in those days, because I found I'd had to get involved in bribery in a lot of European countries, France, Germany, Italy, countries you wouldn't really expect bribery to go on. And yet I found doing business was strictly kosher in the UK and in the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and in fairness, in the Scandinavian countries and the Netherlands. But I thought, we've got nothing in common with the European Union. Anyway, eventually my company was approached by an American corporation and my partner and I decided we'd sell out the business, so we did. He bought a tennis club and I thought I'll try and become an MP. And even though I'd never been a councillor, I did become an MP and did it for 32 years.
And in 2015, you were responsible for Conservatives' campaign for marginal seats. So what did that job teach you about campaigning?
Well, it didn't, but what happened was that I had learned very rapidly, and I did that in 97 when there was a Labour landslide then, but I survived, that the best way to campaign personally was to campaign on local issues. So when I had the responsibility for our by-elections and other things, we concentrated on local issues, because that was the winner, and it usually is.
And you've been in Parliament both when the Conservatives have been in power and also in opposition. So what's been your favourite bit about each period of time?
Well, the great thing and the bad thing about being in opposition is that if you're not the leader of the party, you can relax a bit, because I was in the whip's office, both in opposition and in government. And of course, in opposition, you don't expect to win votes. So it's all a bit more relaxed. Whereas when you're in government, you've got to make sure that you say the right thing and that you try and encourage your colleagues to be loyal to the party. And when you disagree, to talk about it privately with the appropriate government ministers, sometimes the Prime Minister, but not do it publicly. No, it was interesting. I mean, as I said, I was a whip for a while in opposition. And it was great fun because I'd have to be sitting on the front bench doing something. Then if it was a late night debate and nobody was taking part, I'd run to the back benches, do an intervention and get an answer. And then I would sort of walk back to the front bench again. And usually in the secret book we had where we'd comment on interventions, I'd write, brilliant intervention by Michael Fabricant. Have the other party floored, I don't think those comments were taken too seriously, though.
So you enjoyed being in the whip's office?
I did. There was a great sense of camaraderie, and you knew what was going on. I particularly enjoyed it because the chief whip for most of the time that I was there, in opposition and then in government, was Patrick McLaughlin. But Patrick was saying even when he became a Secretary of State, he had less contact with the Prime Minister than when he was Chief Whip. And that really went for the whips as well. We knew what was going on and we knew the procedure and we learned how things work. And you don't do that, actually, either as a regular departmental minister or as a shadow minister.
So you really got to know the inside story there.
I got to know the inside story, and I got to be great friends with some speakers, particularly Lindsay Hoyle, the present speaker, and great enemies with one particular speaker, a nasty bully, John Bercow, who incidentally, by the way, has now been banned from ever entering the House of Commons. I suppose he can go in as a visitor, but I'd love to see him being escorted off the premises.
I was going to say, John Bercow and you did have your spats on occasion, didn't you?
We did, because he was a bully. He was a nasty bit of works. And the House of Commons report said just that, and said that if he had been a member of Parliament, because of course he'd gone by then, if he'd been a member of Parliament, he would have been expelled for life.
Some of the things he did were a bit...
Cruel.
maybe,
Cruel is the word you're speaking to, because he picked on people who couldn't answer him back. One of the people he tried to pick on was me, but found that I did answer him back in the chamber and elsewhere.
Absolutely. And previous to the time that you were in the Whip's office, you were also on a number of parliamentary committees, including DSOS, Home Affairs, European legislation. What work did you enjoy the most during that time?
Oh, DCMS, because I knew about broadcasting. Wasn't so interested in the sports side of things, but I knew all about broadcasting, particularly when I was a new MP, and the film industry too. And one of the things that I'm particularly proud of is we had a great chairman, very different from his public persona, Sir Gerald Kaufman MP. And I said to him, we've got to start making tax breaks. And I negotiated and had meetings with a number of major chartered accountancy firms, very well-known firms, who had divisions which dealt with the film industry. And I got from them proposals about what ought to be done in order to build the film industry in the UK. And eventually I had to leave DCMS because I became a PPS in the Treasury. And I tried to get Ken Clarke, whom I got on with very well, to adopt this programme. And it went through the Treasury machine, so the civil servants understood what I was getting at. Well, Ken Clarke didn't go for it. But the interesting thing is, when Labour got in 97, Gordon Brown, in his very first budget, he must have said, you know, what sort of things can we do to the Treasury officials? And one of the things he did was adopt in its entirety the proposals that we made and I had written in our report on promoting the film industry. And we've now ended up with an incredibly successful film industry in the UK because of the skills that we have in the UK, not just acting, but the craftsmen who get involved, electricians, model makers, and so on and so forth, set builders, and go through a whole long list, lighting. And I think we now have more film studios in and around London than there are in the whole of California, which of course includes Hollywood, and that's something.
Obviously, there are a lot of new MPs who are now members of said committees, and unfortunately these new MPs are in place because of the MPs like yourself who lost their seats. So can you talk us through the election night events, please?
Oh, well, I mean, I'd already got the feeling that I wasn't going to hold Litchfield. I knew it wasn't a personal vote. And in fact, actually, what's been quite irritating, because I still live in Litchfield, is walking in Litchfield. The worst thing that anybody's ever said to me is come up to me and say, Michael, you know, we never thought you'd lose. We're so sorry. If I'd have known, I would never have voted Reform. But, you know, I'm probably more popular now than I've been for a long time. I get people waving at me and tooting their horns at me, and they are waves, they're not gesturing single fingers or anything like that. No, it's quite funny. I think Litchfield was quite shocked actually when I lost, because
well, it's a huge majority, 23,000.
I had a huge
wasn't
majority, but I know it wasn't a vote against me personally, and I also know it wasn't a vote for the National Labour government personally, because fewer than 21% of those eligible to vote actually voted Labour. So, yeah, I got the feeling during the campaign there was going to be a seismic shift. Of course, what didn't help was that 2/3 of my election literature was never distributed by the Royal Mail.
Really?
And that was very, very bad. That's the first time that's happened. I think it was a combination of politics. I think it was a combination also of undermanning in the Royal Mail. But anyway, one way or another, most people in my constituency did not get my election literature, and they should have got it twice. But
Gosh.
2 lots. But there you go. I complained at the time, but, no point in crying over spilt milk. So how did I feel on the night? I was not surprised when it happened that I found out I'd lost, and hope I gave a gracious speech. I think one of the things I said was, I've had 32 years as an MP. Litchfield owes me nothing. I owe Litchfield everything. And yeah, I went not with a cry, but with a bit of a cheer.
Would you go back?
No. No, I've done 32 years. A friend of mine, Justin Webb, who presents the Today programme, said to me that you and your friend Andy Street, you may not accept it, but you've probably left at the best time and get on with other things. And, I have got certain projects well on and progressing right now, and it's interesting.
Well, you're never going to stop, are you?
I'm not going to stop. That's how I stay young.
Absolutely.
And by doing things, I'm doing a bit more broadcasting again, and there's more broadcasting to come. Watch this space.
And how do you think the government is doing so far?
Well, I think I feel the same way as the vast majority of the population. I haven't got the exact figures to hand, but I believe 5 months in, after 1997, Tony Blair's personal popularity rating was plus 64. And Starmer's is about minus 36.
Wow.
So I think the public know precisely how the Labour Party's getting on. And there's no point in boring everyone by rehearsing what they already know. And that is that, well, I think Keir Starmer is a dud. Chris Mason's BBC political editor said that apparently Starmer, when up against a judge arguing a case, would win most of the time, 80% of the time. If he was up against a jury, Starmer couldn't persuade them because he just can't identify with ordinary people. And he can't identify with the electorate. And he can have as many relaunches as he likes. But I'm convinced that there'll be no improvement. Now, the next question is, of course, so what'll happen to this government? They'll keep going for another 4.5 years. But whether Starmer will is another matter altogether. Now, it's a lot easier, as people know, to get rid of a sitting leader in the Conservative Party than it is in the Labour Party. But it has been done. I remember when Labour foolishly got rid of Tony Blair. And I think the same will happen again with Keir Starmer. I think backbenchers will say enough's enough. But who they'll put in his place, God only knows. I mean, my own choice, if I was a backbench Labour MP, would be either Wes Streeting or even Peter Kyle. Have probably now ruined their careers by mentioning their names. But I don't think they'll get it because they're a pretty old left-wing lot on the Labour backbenches, and they'll probably choose Angela Rayner. So I don't see any great bounce in Labour Party's polling if they make that choice.
I was going to ask next, what values do you think are the most important that the government actually follows?
Their values? Well, they're doing what Starmer believes in. The only problem is it's not what the country believes in.
And if you could be remembered for one thing, what would it be?
I think people might say that I was a good constituency MP. Hopefully they won't remember me for First Dates or other TV shows I've done. I helped save the National Memorial Arboretum when it was heading into bankruptcy because they owed huge sums of money for VAT. Managed to persuade the government to write that debt off. There were a number of things which I hope I'll be remembered for. But hey, I'm far too young to start talking about my epitaph.
But what about the best compliment you've ever received?
About the best. Yeah, don't look your age.
And the insult that you're most proud of?
Maybe the trouble with you is you're too clever by half. That's
No,
not a bad insult.
No, sounds about right. I've known you for 23 years now, Michael. It's extraordinary, isn't it?
You'll probably say the problem with you, Michael, is you're just obnoxious. And impossible to get a date for this podcast. We finally managed.
We did. We finally managed it. You mentioned previously that obviously you have a lot of different projects in the pipeline. Is there anything that you can talk us through, or is it all under wraps until
it's
the
under
big
wraps,
launch?
but it's all connected with broadcasting, which actually was my former career.
I'm a celebrity. Get me out of here, maybe. Who knows?
who knows? Who could say? Actually, I know that part of Australia quite well. It's near a place called Mount Tamborine, which is behind actually the Gold Coast, behind Brisbane. I mean, you
A hop,
cannot
skip and a
imagine.
jump.
Well, quite. You can't imagine, though, a more different area. Well, actually, it's a glorified Blackpool. But anyway, that is not one of the possibilities being discussed at the
Not
moment.
yet, not
I'm
yet.
after more regular broadcasting.
And what do you think the world will look like in 5 years' time?
Well, I hope it's not a sort of smouldering wreck after a thermonuclear war. It'll be interesting. I've sort of suggested that Starmer won't last. It'll be interesting to see whether Putin lasts. You know, the Russians pulled out of Afghanistan because of the number of deaths and injuries being caused there to Russian troops. And it's over 3 times as many have been killed and maimed in the Ukraine war so far on the Russian side. And of course, huge damage done on the Ukrainian side too. But at least the Ukrainians are fighting for something they believe in, the defense of their country. Whereas I don't know whether Russian mothers and fathers, and I used to work a lot in Russia in the 80s, so it's a long time ago. It was Soviet Union in those days. In fact, I'm double banned because I was a Conservative MP, and banned in any event because I was expelled from the Soviet Union for activities that were not supposed to be what I was there for. But anyway, it'll be interesting to see whether Putin survived. And the Middle East, you know, will the Ayatollah survive? The Israelis have been very effective in dealing with all the agents like Hezbollah, Hamas, all funded by Iran. And never forget that it's those sorts of agents, those organizations, which maimed and killed British soldiers when they were in Iraq and Afghanistan. The IEDs were often made in Iran. They weren't improvised explosive devices, they were actually manufactured at places around Tehran. So it'll be interesting to see whether Iran has changed. The world's in a very dynamic and changing situation at the moment. It'll be fascinating to see how it'll be in 5 years' time if we haven't blown ourselves up.
Absolutely. And finally, what gives you the most hope for the next generation? And do you feel positive about the future?
Oh, I'm positive. I'm always positive about the future. I'm an optimistic sort of guy, sounding like Tony Blair there. But I think people are well educated. They're inquiring in the UK. I just wish, though, we weren't so depressing. I love the US. I've got a home in the US. You go to America and everyone's upbeat about the United States of America. It's a can-do society, whereas, you know, and Starmer hasn't helped by his talking down the country continually. People are sort of less optimistic about things in the United Kingdom. I want to try and restore that optimism.
And with that, we come to the end of another interview. So, Michael, it was wonderful to hear your wide-ranging insight into Parliament and the world at large. Thank you to the listeners of the podcast. If you have any questions, please feel free to comment. If you think it's worth coming back, please like and subscribe. If you feel you need something to tide you over to the next podcast, please buy my book Party Games on Amazon. And on that note, I'll see you next time. Hope you have a good week, one and all.